Nothing more humbling in a conference that amongst all the academics, all the scholars, than finding that one of the scholars is also a real artist. He can do it all. He not only writes about it, but he makes it. And Murad Khan Mumtaz is a graduate of the National College of Arts in Lahore.
I didn't know that.
It's not in his abstract, in his summary of himself. But actually it was Antonia who found him out. And at the NCA in Lahore, he founded the Hasto Neist Centre for Traditional Art and Culture. Apart from that, Murad is a PhD candidate at the University of Virginia, studying South Asian art with a focus on Indian painting. His interest in North Indian painting grows out of his practice as an artist trained in traditional techniques. Prior to pursuing a PhD, he completed an MFA at Columbia, which he attended on a Fulbright fellowship. His research focuses on devotional portraiture, with a special interest in representation of Muslim saints in early modern India. He was a recent recipient of a one-year Theodore Roosevelt fellowship. It's that statue. I can't get that statue out of my mind. Theodore Roosevelt Fellowship awarded by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and has also been the recipient of research fellowships from the American Institute of Indian Studies, the American Institute of Pakistan Studies, both. He is currently doing research in original sources in the United States on a Council of Library and Information Resources Mellon Fellowship. In 2018, he'll be based in Washington as a History of Art Fellow at the Smithsonian Institute. He's written extensively on the relationship between contemporary miniature painting practice and its traditional precedents. And he exhibits internationally, and if you want to see his work, you need to contact Tracy Williams Limited in New York. So, Murad, over to you.
Thank you for Well, thank you for Julius for the wonderful long introduction. So presenting today's paper both as a practicing artist and as an art historian of South Asia. And of course, I spent 4 years at the very school established by Kipling, which is now the National College of Arts, learning sort of miniature painting, about which we'll talk about the terms themselves. So just the title itself, from Musawwari to miniature painting, it sort of talks about the fact that the name was changed during the British period, and now we really associate the whole genre with miniature, especially in Pakistan and India today. So Musawwari is the traditional local name for the practice, now known as miniature painting. Europeans looking at this tradition from outside in the colonial period introduced the concept of miniature as a term. The Arabic word al-Musawwir is one of the 99 most beautiful names, the Asma al-Husna, of God, that is used self-reflexively in the Quran to refer to God as the artist/creator. This word entered India via the Persian language. And another local Sanskrit word is, of course, Chitrakala, which is still used by practitioners in India. I point out the etymology of the local word Musawwari to highlight the conceptual difference between how this tradition described itself and how the Europeans colonizing the tradition viewed it. The local term connects the painter to the divine archetype of the creator, whereas the reductive materialistic term miniature painting merely describes the art form and its physical attributes, whether that be the perceived smallness of the artwork or whether it refers to the red lead pigment minium. The paper discusses the many transfigurations of Musawwari as it has been refashioned into miniature painting, first by the colonial patrons in the 19th century, and then more recently by contemporary miniature art painters in Pakistan. Since the Mayo School of Arts was envisaged by Kipling as a place for nurturing craft traditions, courtly practices such as calligraphy or Musawwari were really not part of the initial program. Some traditionally trained artists, Some traditionally trained artists continued to be employed by local families, such as the famous Faqir family, who were the governors of Lahore during the first half of the 19th century under Ranjit Singh. And so most probably this painting on the left, which is a copy of a more famous Neem Qalam painting from the Safavid period was made under their patronage in the early 20th century. And on the right, you have the other local artist who was working for Ranjit Singh, Imam Bakhsh Lahori, who was patronized by both British and French patrons during the mid-1800s. However, miniature painting only found a place at the Mayo School sometimes in the 1940s. As has been recently suggested, a plausible explanation for its inclusion could be the shift of focus from Indian design and craft to Indian fine arts, whatever that might mean, as advocated by people like Havel, who was the principal of the Calcutta Art School. The earliest documentation from Musawwari, which was by that time called by its colonial epithet of miniature painting, comes from 1945, when the master painter or Ustad, Haji Muhammad Sharif, who we see here commemorated in a stamp collection celebrating 50 years of art in Pakistan. And he was employed by the Mayo School from 1945 to 1968. Prior to his appointment, he had been working at the neighboring court in Punjab at Patiala. And here are some of his the examples of his work. I think most probably this painting on the left was made during his tenure at the court of Patiala, as you can see. And then on the right, once he was in a more British-oriented establishment, he, I think, was most probably had to make artworks which were more Bazari in nature, sort of evoking this sort of exoticized idea of Mughal art. Even though his own training is not really specifically Mughal, it's a sort of Sikh-inspired later Mughal. And we can see that his work represents a popular Bazari work, especially when he was doing it at the Mayo School, which is a very late, sort of a very, very late Mughal idiom that was widely exoticized by the British. In terms of quality and inspiration, the work is a far cry from its Mughal and Rajput predecessors and has suffered serious amputations. And we can talk at length about the paper itself, the pigment, and the language, the formal language as well. And its partial dialogue with its own tradition is only sustained through colonial modifications. Despite this shift in British established art schools from craft training to fine arts in the first half of the 20th century, some artisanal traditions persisted at the Mayo School right into the 21st century, including metalwork and woodwork. In fact, the metalwork and woodwork workshops were still active, and they folded only at the time when I joined the National College of Art in 2000. So in between around that time, they were pretty much forgotten little places. I mean, they weren't little, but no one really even went to that space. So we were never trained to engage with those workshops, even though they were still continuing to produce things. And they finally folded in, I think, 2001. At the time of its inception in the 1940s, miniature painting didn't quite fit into the Western model of fine arts. And even though it wasn't considered to be a craft either, it was still slotted into the curriculum as a workshop-based idiom and was only offered as an optional subject until 1958, when it was finally inducted into the fine arts syllabus. So till 1958, it was very much like the wood workshop and the metal workshop, this sort of forgotten little sort of thing which lesser artisans work at, whereas in the hierarchy, the easel painters and the sculptors were definitely placed above them. I believe that it was because of Lockwood's vision that certain art forms that were considered as crafts survived at the Mayo School much beyond the partition of the subcontinent, and allowed for the initial induction of miniature painting that sort of lay somewhere between fine arts and a craft at that time, according to the European yardstick. However, this introduction of an art form into an institution built on a colonial pedagogical methodology came with a heavy price. Lockwood's enthusiasm for local traditions led him to collect and preserve in the Lahore Central Museum both historical artworks as well as objects made by contemporary artisans. In the Mayo School, and I think we all love this picture, you'll keep seeing it. And the Mayo School of Industrial Arts, local artisans were given shelter and encouragement in the wake of dwindling patronage. No doubt, the endeavor was a heroic gesture, but yet, as Abigail pointed out, it was also a very paternal gesture towards preserving and continuing indigenous artistic traditions at a time when industrialization and modernism were rapidly transmuting, waylaying, and destroying local heritage. However, with local systems of patronage no longer representing the cultural mainstream, Kipling's pedagogical model presented a compromise. the attenuated system of preserving traditional arts and crafts that he initiated, while being a positive step against colonial and modernist whitewashing, set a precedent that in varying degrees continues to haunt pedagogy at the National College of Arts to this day. And I think one of the main problems that, in a way, was initiated by Lockwood Kipling was a lack of engagement with local patronage. And I think that really led to the destruction or the gradual disintegration of the crafts. By dislocating or relocating indigenous artists previously trained in family-based workshops and supported by local benefactors into a British established school of industrial art, a gradual dilution of skill-based learning was inevitable. In the field of Musawwari, this break from indigenous systems of learning allowed the genre to mutate into a contemporary art form that, I argue, exoticizes the tradition while ignoring its fundamental conceptual frameworks. Today, owing to this exoticization of the art form in Pakistan, students, teachers, and scholars alike are completely unaware of its colonial history, including the accompanying transfigurations that the art form underwent during that period. Over the last 2 decades, contemporary miniature painting, as it is known, strongly identified that Pakistan has become a global phenomenon. This movement has garnered more attention for contemporary Pakistani artists than any other in the country's brief history. Recent scholarship has played a major role in defining the terms of the movement, from its pedagogy to its representation in the international art market. However, the critical voices that have shaped and guided this field have often made contradictory assertions about artists' relationship to historical practice. While these specialists envision the practice to be a continuation of the pre-colonial tradition of Mughal painting, the nature of this continuity is highly questionable. The theorists of the contemporary miniature genre typically construct its socio-political identity around 2 key factors. They propose an imagined consolidated Islamic heritage embodied by the great Mughals. And I think here's where Julius's point of how India, after partition, has really maintained certain crafts and traditions, and how Pakistan has not really done enough. It has to do with this sort of imagined heritage, in which a lot of the local crafts and local histories are suppressed in favor of this imagined large sort of pan-Islamic identity. And in engagement with historical material practices and aspects of workshop culture, that's the other thing that is promoted, which is unique to imperial patronage. In keeping with the political climate of modern Pakistan, this trajectory suppresses historical and cultural factors that fall outside the Mughal artistic paradigm. Largely ignored, yet always hovering like a specter, is the colonial presence in the formation of this contemporary art form. Following the political, cultural, and existential upheavals that the subcontinent suffered during the colonial period, the newly formed state of Pakistan was conditioned to feel embarrassed of its own indigenous art and culture, looking primarily to reinforce Western models to build a new nationalist identity. As a direct result, a majority of local art practices have gradually disappeared. Practices that Kipling fought so hard to preserve and revive in the 19th century. Miniature painting managed to survive by finding a tiny niche at the Mayo School. In 1958, miniature painting was elevated from being a forgotten, bazaari sort of art to being offered as a minor subject. Students still did not have the option of majoring in it. In 1968, Haji Muhammad Sharif retired from his position and was replaced by Ustad Sheikh Shujaullah, a master musawwir who came from a family of traditional artists from Amber, Jaipur, Rajasthan. In 1974, a young Bashir Ahmed, there he is, not so young anymore, a young Bashir Ahmed, a recent graduate at the National College of Arts, began his 7-year apprenticeship with Ustad Shujaullah. With his Ustad's guidance, Ahmed learned late Mughal painting techniques until Shujaullah's death in 1980. At that time, Ahmed succeeded his Ustad as the NCA's miniature painting instructor. Seeing the need for institutional support for the art form's preservation in a modern context, Ahmed campaigned for its introduction into the undergraduate curriculum. Due to fierce resistance from within the faculty, he felt the need to modernize the traditional practice. In fact, I can't help but notice certain parallels between Bashir Ahmed and John Lockwood Kipling. First and foremost was what, as Abigail pointed out, this need to find new patronage. and to always adapt to that patronage demands rather than looking at local or indigenous systems of patronage. That's something that Bashir Ahmed also very consciously tried to promote, especially this idea of modernizing an ancient tradition. Both educators worked for the preservation and revival of tradition or traditions, but had to be extremely mindful of the Mayo School establishment that in both cases clung firmly to Western-centric values. In 1982, Bashir Ahmed successfully convinced the NCA, the National College of Arts, to offer miniature painting as a major subject for the first time. Within 2 decades, the miniature program had become the most popular in the school, leading to international recognition and a new genre known as neo-miniature or contemporary miniature. It is worth noting that this trajectory of modern practice in Pakistan has followed a path quite distinct, both in form and content, from the Musawwari or the Chitrakala tradition that is being practiced in India today. For miniaturists in Pakistan, condensing a traditional methodology into a modern academic system has come with a heavy price. Integral material and philosophical practices that were once transmitted organically through the Ustad-Shagird or the master-disciple relationship or paradigm have been sacrificed. By contrast, Musawwirs or Chitraeras in India continue to be more rooted in hereditary artisanal guild systems despite dwindling patronage. And here's an example of one of these workshops, the workshop of Ajay Sharma in Jaipur. He's a very popular artist, very much steeped in the tradition, hereditary practice. And on the right, you have the first breakthrough artist from the NCA who was is still practicing in New York, mostly she shows. And so you can see the sort of conceptual, formal divergences that have occurred in the two countries. And it would one day be an excellent sort of idea to perhaps have a more serious study that combines or draws a parallel between contemporary Indian and contemporary Pakistani miniature practice. I mean, that one day, maybe. Yeah. Additionally, Pakistani students are given minimal historical background in which to contextualize their practice. A decontextualized reproduction from books and exhibition catalogs is the primary pedagogical tool. This is in stark contrast to the traditional modes of transmission, in which students would work from original artworks in an environment often immersed in a sacred ambience. In landmark studies initiated by scholars such as Ananda Kumar Swamy and Moti Chandra, we get important insights into traditional workshop methods and its pedagogy. In his seminal study on techniques of Mughal painting, which was actually written in the 1950s, and since that time there has been no second book on Mughal techniques, which is quite strange. So it's the only work that really exists. Pramod Chandra quotes from the 14th century metaphysician Madhavacharya to make the point that material practices of traditional painting resonated with religious significance. Whether artists practicing the technique were always conscious of it or not is another matter. Discussing the 4 stations of higher self, Madhavacharya compares them with the 4 stages of a painting, in which the surface, in this case prepared cotton cloth, is washed, burnished, drawn upon, and finally colored. And of course, you see that practice still being adhered to. At the top, you have from a workshop in India. Here you have the paper being a single sheet being washed, and here it's being glued together to form a wasli. That's what the paper is called. And over here is the sizing on the right. It's being sized with the local white pigment. It varies from place to place. And at the bottom, these are just is one painting which I made. And so I thought it'd be nice to show it as a sort of step by step. I tried to follow this traditional method, which is really not taught at the NCA. But I think the results were very fascinating for myself, my experience. It is important to note that this process is still strictly adhered to in traditional painting workshops in India, and I've personally learned a great deal from artists trained in that tradition. Fields of education in pre-colonial India were located in the master-student or Ustad-Shagird relationship. In an ideal traditional setting, the Ustad is not only a teacher, but also a moral, religious, and spiritual guide. A tiny glimpse of which I was fortunate enough to get through my personal instruction that I received from Bashir Ahmed. apart from just the classes that I had to take. But in the summer and other times, I spent more time with him, and that's when he really opened up and sort of moved from this modernist mindset, when he was more comfortable doing that. Furthermore, in most guilds, the act of initiation is essential for a shagird to formally enter the guild. Just as in spiritual orders, this act is symbolic of a rebirth, an entry into a new lineage. Through the rite of initiation, the disciple is linked to a chain that can be traced back to the founder of the guild, allowing barakah or divine grace to flow into the work produced. The art of Musavri, still in India, is primarily based on the family workshop system and always has been more or less. In the catalogue of the 2005 exhibition, Karkhana, a contemporary collaboration, Virginia Wiles, current critic and collector, asserts that the participating artists have, quote, reclaimed the original eclecticism of the Mughal style, one that owed its rich hybridity to the collaborative nature of miniature practice. It is the intercultural dialogue encouraged by the Mughal Emperor Akbar that suggests an appropriate precedent for these artists, end quote. The exhibition and its accompanying catalogue revolved around a collaboration between 6 contemporary Pakistani artists, claiming to engage with the idea of the traditional workshop, as it was practiced under Emperor Akbar's imperial patronage. In fact, in Akbar's time, it was called a tasveer khana and not a karkhana. The karkhana could be in any workshop. Tasveer khana is particularly a picture-making workshop. For every painting, one artist would initiate a composition and then mail it to the other, who would then make their own artistic contribution, and so on until all the 6 had intervened on the artwork. Even though Wilde's assertion about reclaiming the original eclecticism of Mughal painting seems to attractively integrate historical practice with contemporary innovation and cultural pluralism, it in fact glosses over a time gap of more than 4 centuries between the rule of Akbar and modern-day Pakistan. This narrative, passionately promoted by dealers and collectors of contemporary miniature painting, also ignores the influence of parallel painting traditions that existed before, during, and after the grand Mughal era. Furthermore, authors such as the collector critic Virginia Wiles imply that the collaborative workshop culture was unique to the Mughal tradition, when in fact there is ample evidence that traditional painters working in the Pahari, Punjabi, Rajasthani traditions were and still are intensely collaborative in their approach. And this is a workshop which is very much active still in the Pahari region, in the Kangra Valley. It is my contention that the aforementioned Karkhana project, as its very name suggests, aimed to evoke imaginative projections of the traditional workshop without actually representing its true structure. It is important to remember that unlike modern and postmodern Western-centric canons, the goal of South Asian traditional art is not to develop personal style, but instead to aspire toward pre-existing ideals that are often rooted in idealized models. A shagird or student's training usually begins with basic drawing assignments that develop the hand and eye. These consist of line practice and copying floral patterns. Simultaneously, the shagird assists the ustad in all manner of daily and household chores. This first phase of apprenticeship can last from a year to a decade, depending on the capacity of the shagird, and is meant to instill a sense of humility and conformity, notions that don't snugly fit into our individualistic expectations of the artist's role in society. Gradually, the shagird advances to more complex assignments, including copying from older masterpieces or from the ustad's own studies. And here's a wonderful example, and I've consciously put 19th century examples here, just to show that how the tradition was very much active and alive until the great sort of colonial intervention, in which those systems collapsed pretty rapidly. But even up into the mid-19th century, you have this example of clearly an ustad, because this is part of a larger series that I found in Lahore Museum of these drawings made by an ustad, and of course there are also directions of what colors to fill. They don't sometimes always follow. The students don't always follow the color. But by and large, you can see how it's copying that earlier painting. And of course, we don't have much time to discuss it, but of course you also see this idea of the itinerant masters who had to travel for patronage. Historically, the nobility or the ruling elite patronized the best artists and consulted with masters directly, often shaping artistic developments. patrons and artists, and in fact the whole culture, shared a common set of values. The intention behind making an artwork was not to reflect the sensorial world in its accidentality, but rather to depict archetypal qualities through idealized form. A horse in a traditional painting is not just a particular horse, but principally the ideal horse. And of course, after the Mughal presence, you have the marriage of that ideal with the particular. And then that continues on into the 18th centuries and beyond. A wonderful example of how the ideal is depicted in a traditional Indian painting is cited in an 18th century Rajput text on horses called Shukraniti. Quote, "If an image is to be made, the appropriate pattern or model should always be placed in front of the artist. No image can be made without a model. So the artist should frame the limbs after meditating on the horse and finding out the measurements and attributes of horses in the manner indicated above." End quote. In this case, indicated above refers to preceding verses in the text explaining the specific measurements of the ideal horse. The text is suggesting that the artist commissioned to paint a specific horse should be well versed in the ideal measurements of the horse, so that the end product will be a union of that ideal and this particular. In the contemporary academic setting, the once intimate relationship between Ustad and Shagird has now been replaced by the comparatively detached relationship of teacher and student. It just sounds slightly dull, teacher-student. Additionally, the intensive apprenticeship that formally unfolded over decades has been condensed into 2 to 4 academic years. On the one hand, the academic format in Pakistan has allowed miniature painting to survive. On the other hand, students of the art can only hope to build a superficial understanding of the art form detached from its primary context. Within this new system, miniature is reimagined as an art form that rewards individual style and mimics the cultural values of the modern and postmodern West, thereby rooting its origins more firmly in the colonial and post-colonial paradigm rather than the pre-colonial period, despite prolonging the myth of a continuity with a tradition that goes back to the period of the great Mughals. For example, contemporary artists perpetuate visual forms of perspective and naturalism that were introduced in the colonial period, even when they are unaware of it. And here, of course, you can see it very clearly being reflected, because this is a colonial period watercolor on ivory. And even the technique changes, because once you have to work on ivory or a very hard surface, you have to work with stippling. And that's a specific sort of over-rendered quality that is really championed in the late 18th and into the 19th century. So you don't have those sort of built-up spaces with those very translucent washes anymore. You have this idea of you just go attack the white surface with this stippling technique. And so this contemporary artist, who is a graduate of NCA, is doing exactly the same. You can see that there's no layering of pigments. He's even using a very specifically colonial technique, which has been taught to him as being a Mughal technique. So, in fact, we were all taught that this was the Mughal technique. So, and even, of course, at Kipling School, of course, this beautiful painting has certain sort of compromises within it. So even at Kipling's Mayo School, when miniature painting was not part of the program, local artists such as Muhammad Deen, who were probably trained, at least trained to look at traditional artworks, and maybe he even was traditionally trained at some level, were then sort of retrained as draftsmen. And so they had to make a compromise between their own tradition and their education in European canons. And here you can see that compromise, that even though the overall flatness and the meticulous details and the beautiful, luscious colors are very much from a local understanding, but you have one source of light, of course, and that's a very European element. And then the way the domes are rendered is also this chiaroscuro happening you would never see in the local idiom. And most of all, the fact that it's just this blank, empty space. I mean, that's just almost unheard of within the traditional idea of, unless it's a specific portrait of someone. Then you would have that blank space. The perpetuation of privileging alien systems of viewing and capturing reality has left such an indelible mark that currently ideas filtering in from the West through various indirect channels are appropriated unchallenged, without a serious theoretical grounding in either contemporary modes of art making or in indigenous methodologies. Critics not only welcome these changes as inevitable, but hail them as remarkable instances of hybridization of culture. And I think here the whole sort of neo-colonialist literature is sort of to blame for a lot of this. We don't need to discuss that. I don't want to go there. This ideological mimicking echoes the changes that transpired in the technique of miniature painting in the 19th century, when British watercolor practices were introduced to local artists. Owing to the shift in patronage in the 19th century, artists were forced to adapt their practice to new ways of looking. Successful artists, such as Imam Bakhsh Lahori, at this time could easily switch between styles, but they had to, of course. An excellent example is Imam Bakhsh Lahori. He was one of the chief master artists working at the court of Ranjit Singh in Lahore, and was also at the same time commissioned by one of the French officers of the Sikh army, Jean-Marie Lafont, for an illustrated book of series, and this is the first page from that. And he's clearly using, and Jean-Marie Lafont wanted him to use his own traditional training in Sikh and late Mughal idioms, so he did that to wonderful effect. But then, after the Sikh period ended, he had to find new patronage, and he did find that in the form of patrons, colonial patrons. And here you can see how he's sort of trying his hand at perspective and foreshortening. It's not entirely successful, but he's learning. He has to learn. But it's pretty awkward also. Researching the material practices of Musawwari gives us another insight into the compromises that have shaped the development of contemporary miniature painting as it transitioned through the colonial period into the post-partition curriculum. One example of this phenomenon is the disappearance of handmade Wasli paper in Pakistan. These are examples of a workshop in Rajasthan, which is still making Wasli paper, and I personally only use their paper now because it's the best that's available. Totally organic material, traditional methods, more or less. The preferred painting surface for traditional North Indian Musawwirs, Wasli, which originates from the Arabic and Persian word wasl, meaning physical and metaphysical union, is made by gluing together thin sheets of handmade paper and burnishing the top layer. The choice of surface is of utmost importance, and historically artists took great pains to acquire the most refined paper possible. The region of Punjab, partitioned to Pakistan, was once renowned for handmade paper making. Sialkot, a city in northeast Punjab, close to Kashmir, produced an exquisite tissue-thin yet extremely tough paper that has since passed into legend as a direct result of the introduction of cheap industrial paper imported from Europe in the 19th century. And over here, it's a wonderful example, although it's a little dark. But you can see this is not a Wasli, it's just one tissue-thin paper. It hasn't been glued together. It's been used for a preparatory drawing. But they're using these natural pigments for these washes, and the paper doesn't buckle or anything. It just really takes all of that pigment. And it's a beautiful example of a Pahari painting. The technique for preparing Wasli paper that Ahmed introduced at NCA is only partially rooted in this tradition. Students have no choice but to produce Wasli using heavily bleached and acidic imported paper that usually starts yellowing within a few years. And I have had that experience myself. So the unnaturally thick and rigid quality of Wasli favored at NCA encourages students to explore more experimental techniques, originally alien to Musawwari, such as photographic realism. And here, the Wasli paper in Pakistan is so hard that it actually almost resembles ivory. So you see how artists have to adapt to this other technique, and so they lose the originals of the earlier practice. Knowledge of pigments, unfortunately, has followed a similar course of departure. Almost all the paints are imported European industrial watercolors, whereas in India, once again, that tradition is still very much alive in multiple workshops. And here you have in Chamba, in the Pahari region, Vijay Sharma's workshop, where they are preparing cinnabar, which turns into shingraf, one of the most important pigments in Indian painting. You see it on all the borders in Rajasthani and Pahari painting. And here you can see the voyeur Krishna looking at Radha cooking. And of course, the screen is made from shingraf. And here they're actually siphoning out different grades of shingraf. And on the border, they might use a cheaper, quicker grade of shingraf, and so on and so forth. The students in Pakistan, the students' lack of exposure to traditional material preparation has led to a marked indifference towards craft in general, creating for the first time in more than 2,000 years a decisive break in methods and materials within a South Asian practice that goes back to at least the 1st century BC. Perhaps, and I'm not being romantic here, because when you look at the Ajanta techniques, they're stunningly similar to what is still being practiced in India. The way you prepare the ground, the way you start with a red basic drawing, and then the way you build up colors, it's remarkably similar. And Kumar Swami was, of course, also sort of found those sort of similarities as well. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why Pakistani miniaturists have broken away from traditional conceptual models as well and readily replaced them with 20th century westernized modes of thinking and representation. And this is definitely not Shingraf. The fact that patronage has shifted into the sphere of contemporary global art has also contributed to this transformation. Contemporary miniature practice has been comfortably slotted into a niche that reflects larger trends in the art market. In general, for the last 3 decades or so, artists hailing from non-white and especially Muslim countries are given recognition more readily if they engage with issues of identity politics and cultural satire, particularly those who criticize, subvert, or caricaturize their own cultural values. I don't think I have to say too much about this. Both practicing artists and promoters encourage the myth and that contemporary miniature painting from Pakistan has released, to quote one of the foremost miniaturists in the country, something that has been in hibernation for the last 100 years, and have finally given wings to a tradition initiated by the atelier of Emperor Akbar, end quote. What is ignored is that apart from an aesthetic, superficial appropriation of traditional imagery, sufficient enough to generate an exotic appeal for a cosmopolitan audience, the contemporary practice shares little else with its pre-colonial ancestor. And just like a personal anecdote, whenever we were practicing at the NCA, we would always only look at reproductions from books. So, and this idea of malachite was definitely associated with this grand Mughal way of representing color. And so whenever we would try to replicate malachite, it would be this color, which is a light blue. And to this day, it suddenly dawned on me that in my mind, malachite is light blue. And then when I actually looked at the original paintings, it has nothing to do with that. And so you can see this artist, in his own way, is trying to echo this Mughal Shah Jahan period type example, but he just has no idea of what malachite is because we haven't gone through that engagement with material. It needs to be reiterated that Mughal painting shared its material and conceptual framework with other parallel Indian traditions, such as the numerous Pahari and Rajasthani schools. Mughal painting did not develop within a cultural bubble, but was part of the larger Indian cultural, political, and spiritual milieu. With the establishment of direct British rule in 19th century North India, in 19th century North India, there was a distinct break, not only in patronage patterns, but also in the materials and methods. Which is why contemporary miniature painting is less a continuation of pre-modern South Asian painting traditions, but rather, similar to Pakistan itself, an outcome of the encounter between the colonizer and the colonized. Perhaps I shouldn't be saying that in Pakistan. In a way, both Kipling and Bashir Ahmed failed in their efforts to revive indigenous practices. In Kipling's case, the Mayo School gradually weaned out most of the crafts introduced and preserved by him. And in the 1940s, it became a fine arts college. With Bashir Ahmed's miniature painting department, what he had learnt traditionally under his Ustad gave way by the 1990s to a miniaturist aesthetic, often exoticized and used in the service of contemporary art, which continues to be deeply entrenched in postmodern canons that have emerged from within a Western and westernizing discourse. Thank you.